What would you do if you heard a cry in the frozen forest, only to find a newborn bobcat abandoned by its own mother? Most would step back, believing nature must take its course. But one man couldn't walk away. That desperate decision turned his quiet cabin into a nursery, his nights into endless battles against time, and his life into a bond no one believed possible. How does a wild predator become a shadow at your heels, a heartbeat beside your own? And what happens when love collides with instinct and a creature learns to live between two worlds? The snow had fallen heavier than usual that November, blanketing the forests around Baxter State Park in a silence so thick it felt eternal. Every branch sagged beneath its weight, every ridge softened into pale curves, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Yet amid that silence came a sound that would not be ignored, a thin, wavering cry that cut through the night like a splinter in glass. The patrol team had been scanning the area for signs of illegal traps, their breath clouding in the glow of headlamps when they found her. A female bobcat, her mottled coat streaked with blood, one hind leg twisted unnaturally within the steel jaws of a snare. She had fought hard, too hard, judging from the deep lacerations along her shoulders where she had thrown herself against the snow in desperate attempts to break free. It took 3 men to pin the animal safely, another to work the release mechanism on the trap. Even after being freed, she trembled violently, her eyes wide with terror, every instinct demanding she fight even in her exhaustion. They carried her to the truck on a heavy canvas tarp, the crimson drops of blood staining the snow behind them in a line that seemed endless. At the small wildlife outpost, heat lamps and IV fluids were already prepared. The team worked in tense silence, aware that the bobcat was not only wounded but pregnant, her swollen belly rising and falling with shallow breaths. Hours stretched into dawn. One of the younger volunteers whispered, "She doesn't have a chance." But the head veterinarian shook his head grimly and pressed on. By evening, against all odds, the bobcat gave birth to a single cub. Tiny, blind, fragile, yet alive. For a moment the cabin filled with cautious hope. Perhaps this cub would be her reason to fight. Perhaps survival could still be wrestled from the cruelty of a steel snare. But when the newborn was placed beside her, the mother snarled, ears flat, muscles rigid despite her weakness. She swiped her paw, forcing the cub away, then turned her head as though he did not exist. Again and again the team tried, only to meet the same rejection. Trauma had stolen something vital, her instinct to nurture, to recognize her own offspring. The cub cried into the night, a high, piercing sound that echoed through the beams of the outpost rafters and carried out into the pines. That sound drew the attention of Daniel Hayes, the technician on call that night. Daniel was 42, a man weathered by Maine winters and personal loss. A widower for 3 years, he lived in a modest cabin near the edge of the park, throwing himself into work as a way to outpace his grief. Animals, in their raw honesty, had become his only reliable companions. He was not prepared for fatherhood again, not of any kind, human or animal. But when he bent over the trembling cub and felt its tiny body pressed into his palm, the decision made itself. No one argued when he asked to take the cub home. The head vet only gave a weary nod. Some chances, however slim, belonged to those willing to bear the weight of them. As Daniel wrapped the cub in a wool scarf and stepped out into the sharp night air, the sound of its cry still carried between the trees, fragile, insistent, demanding to be answered. It was in that moment, under the frozen stars of Maine, that fate drew its first line between a solitary man and a wild creature that the world had already abandoned. The drive back to Daniel's cabin was short, but it felt endless with the tiny cub cradled inside his coat. Each bump on the snowy road sent a jolt of fear through him. Was the cub still breathing? Was it warm enough? He kept a hand pressed gently against its body, feeling the faint rhythm of life beneath fur no thicker than thistledown. When he pushed open the cabin door, the familiar smell of wood smoke and pine greeted him, but tonight it felt like stepping into a battlefield. He had no crib, no incubator, none of the equipment a newborn animal might need, only the rough tools of a woodsman's life. He moved quickly, setting the cub down on the kitchen table and rifling through drawers until he found an old shoebox. He lined it with flannel scraps and slid it near the wood stove, hoping the gentle heat would mimic the warmth of a mother's body. The cub's cries pierced the still air. They were thin, insistent, impossible to ignore. Daniel fumbled with the formula powder the vet had given him, heating water on the stove and mixing it until his hands trembled. He remembered the instructions clearly: 2-hour feedings, day and night. It felt like a task meant for a team, not one tired man in a cabin on the edge of the forest. At first, the cub resisted. Its mouth was too small for the rubber nipple of the bottle. Milk dribbled down its chin as Daniel coaxed gently, whispering words that surprised even him. "Come on, little one, don't quit on me now." After several attempts, the cub latched weakly, sucking just enough to quiet its cries. Relief washed over him, followed by a terror even greater. What if he couldn't keep this up? What if it died in his hands? The night unfolded in fragments of exhaustion. At 10 p.m., then midnight, then 2 a.m., Daniel rose from his chair by the stove, fed the cub, cleaned the tiny body with a warm cloth, and tucked it back into the shoebox. Between feedings he dozed, sitting upright, boots still on, jerking awake at every sound. The winter wind rattled the shutters, but above it all he heard only the small, determined breaths of the creature beside him. By 4 a.m. his body felt broken, eyes burning, back stiff, nerves frayed. He wondered if this was what new fathers felt in hospital rooms, pacing the halls in sleepless circles. Except he was alone here, with no nurse to call, no wife to lean on, no one to reassure him that he was doing it right. He stared at the cub, so small he could close his hand around its entire body, and asked aloud, "Why you? Why me?" The silence offered no answer. It was just before dawn when the moment came. Daniel lifted the cub for its 5th feeding, expecting the same restless squirming and weak latch. Instead, the tiny bobcat opened its eyes. For the first time, amber slits of life looked directly into his own. The gaze was unsteady, blurred with newness, yet in it, Daniel saw something undeniable, a recognition, a connection, forged in the fragile hours of survival. The cub's cry quieted, its body stilled, comforted not by milk or blankets, but by his presence alone. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat, unexpected and heavy. He whispered without thinking, "I keep you safe. Whatever it takes." As the first grey light spread across the snow outside, the cabin no longer felt like an empty shelter, but the fragile beginning of a bond neither man nor bobcat had asked for, yet both desperately needed. By morning, he had given the cub a name, Echo, for the way its first cries had carried through the pines, demanding an answer. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of sleeplessness and fragile hope. Daniel's cabin, once a quiet refuge of solitude, transformed into something closer to a nursery. Every corner seemed to carry a reminder of his new responsibility. The shoebox by the stove, bottles drying on the counter, scraps of flannel folded neatly on the back of a chair. Where once the silence had pressed against him like a weight, now it was filled with small sounds. Echo's chirps, the restless shuffle of tiny paws, the rhythmic suckling of midnight feedings. Friends from town called, offering their usual invitations to ice fishing trips or evenings at the diner. Daniel declined each one, his excuses half-hearted. "Got my hands full up here," he'd mutter. Most assumed he meant snow clearing or maintenance on his cabin. Only a few colleagues at the wildlife center knew the truth. When one friend dropped by unannounced, Daniel stood in the doorway, dark circles under his eyes, blocking the sight of the tiny bobcat tucked inside on a blanket. "You look awful," the man laughed. Daniel only shrugged. Awful or not, he knew there was no other choice. Echo's life depended on him. As Echo grew, so did her needs. At 2 weeks, she wobbled across the table, legs splayed wide, body trembling with the effort of standing. Daniel crouched beside her, his breath caught in his chest as she toppled, then pushed herself up again. Every stumble was followed by another attempt, and another, until the soft pads of her paws finally held steady on the wooden surface. "That's it," Daniel whispered, his voice raw with pride. "That's how you survive." By the end of the month, Echo was no longer content with the shoebox. She explored the cabin with curious determination, dragging herself across rugs, sniffing at boots by the door, pawing at the hems of Daniel's work pants. He began documenting everything, feeding times, weight, how she responded to different sounds or textures. The act started as scientific record-keeping, a technician's duty. But somewhere in the pages of his notebook, the cold notes softened. Beside figures and measurements, he scribbled phrases like, "seems calmer when I hum," or "looked for me after waking." Daniel noticed Echo's attachment most in the evenings. If he stepped out onto the porch to split firewood, she would cry until he returned. If he sat at the desk writing, she curled into the folds of his flannel sleeve, breathing in rhythm with his arm. Sometimes he thought of his late wife, of the silence that had haunted this cabin since her passing. Echo's presence didn't erase that loss, but it threaded new meaning through the quiet spaces. Still, the bond was fragile. Echo grew slowly, smaller than a cub her age should be. Each day, Daniel feared he might wake to find her still and cold, another casualty of the wild's cruelty. He carried that fear like a stone, heavy but unspoken. Yet each time Echo opened her eyes, those amber sparks that seemed to know him already, something inside him softened, and the stone lifted a little. There was no denying the strange symmetry of their lives, one man hollowed by loss, and one creature rejected before she'd even had a chance to live. Together they were stumbling forward, each learning from the other. Echo was learning to walk, to feed, to survive. And Daniel, without realizing it, was learning too, learning that love could return in the most unexpected form, and that sometimes the smallest heartbeat could teach a man to live again. It happened by accident, the kind of accident that changes everything. One cold evening, after a long day of splitting wood and tending to Echo's feedings, Daniel returned to the cabin to find his laundry still damp from the line. He cursed softly under his breath. The firewood pile had soaked his gloves, and now he had nothing warm to wear. Digging through the back of the closet, he pulled out an old flannel shirt, the kind with faded red and black plaid squares and a missing button near the collar. It had been his father's once, then his, and now it was nothing more than a ragged relic he couldn't bear to throw away. He tossed it absent-mindedly into Echo's bedding to add another layer of warmth. Within seconds, the cub nosed into it, pressing her tiny muzzle against the fabric, pawing clumsily until she was half buried in the folds. She quieted instantly, curling into the soft plaid, as though it carried something she had been missing all along. That night, for the first time, she slept without restless cries, her breaths deep and even. Daniel took note. The next morning, when he washed the bedding and set it back by the stove, he left the shirt in place. Again, Echo burrowed into it with single-minded determination. She rubbed her nose against the sleeve until she fell asleep, one paw resting on the fabric, as if to guard it. What began as coincidence quickly became ritual. If Daniel tried to tuck her in without the flannel, she fussed and chirped until he relented. He couldn't help but laugh one evening as he shook the shirt open and she waddled straight toward it, practically tripping over her oversized paws in her hurry to reach it. All right, he chuckled. Can't sleep without your fancy pajamas, huh? Soon the jokes spread to his colleagues at the center. When he mentioned her peculiar attachment during a checkup, one of the vets smirked, "Guess you've got the world's first lumberjack bobcat." Even Daniel had to admit the image was ridiculous. This wild creature, descendant of hunters, comforted not by pine boughs or her mother's fur, but by a worn piece of flannel. And yet, beneath the humor was something heavier, something Daniel didn't say aloud. The shirt had become her substitute for what she'd lost. At night, when storms rattled the windows and shadows twisted against the walls, Echo would drag the shirt close and bury her face in it, as if hiding in its memory. To Daniel, it was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. She had never known her mother's warmth, never pressed into her chest for safety. Instead, she had chosen this scrap of cloth, and somehow, in its faded fibers, found the comfort she was missing. Watching her, Daniel sometimes wondered if he had done the same. The shirt carried his father's scent once, then his own. Now it carried hers. 3 lives stitched together by threads of fabric, by absence and survival. It was a strange comfort indeed, but one that bound them closer than either could have expected. By the time Echo reached 6 months, the shoebox and flannel-lined nest were things of the past. She had outgrown every corner of the cabin, padding silently across the floorboards with a confidence that made Daniel both proud and uneasy. The fragile, trembling cub was gone. In her place was a sleek, muscled shadow that moved with the first hints of a predator's grace. She practiced it constantly. Daniel would catch her crouching low behind the kitchen table, amber eyes fixed on his boots as if he were unsuspecting prey. She would wait, tail tip, twitching, until he passed, then leap with sudden, playful ferocity, knocking into his shins before darting under the bed. More than once she startled him so badly he dropped whatever he was carrying, and though he scolded her, he couldn't hide the grin tugging at his face. Echo's games grew bolder. She discovered the sink one afternoon, leaping onto the counter while Daniel rinsed dishes. Before he could react, she slid into the basin with a splash, her fur instantly soaked. Instead of panic, she pawed at the streaming water with fascination, scattering droplets across the kitchen. Daniel stood frozen, then burst into laughter. "You're supposed to fear water, you little lunatic," he said, reaching for a towel. But Echo only chirped, swiping at the faucet as though she'd found her new favorite toy. Her curiosity extended to mirrors. The cabin had one old rectangular piece hanging near the door, its edges chipped with age. The first time she caught her reflection, she froze, body tense, ears forward. Then came the pounce, claws against glass, frustrated trills as she tried to catch the other bobcat, who never yielded. Hours passed before she tired of the battle, sprawling in front of it with one paw extended, as if conceding to a companion she could never reach. Despite the humor, Daniel saw the seriousness beneath it. These instincts, stalking, ambushing, testing boundaries, were the beginnings of what she was meant to be. And though she played with gentleness, there was no mistaking the power building in her limbs. She could leap to the top of the sofa in a single bound now. Her paws, once the size of coins, were broad and padded, tipped with claws sharp enough to tear into bark. Yet with Daniel she remained oddly restrained. During their rough housing, she never bit down hard, never extended her claws fully. She seemed to know the line between play and danger, adjusting her strength as if aware that he was fragile compared to her. Sometimes she placed her forepaws on his shoulders, pressing her face against his neck in a gesture that felt startlingly like a hug. In those moments, Daniel realized how much trust flowed both ways. He trusted her not to hurt him, and she trusted him to be her anchor in a world that was half wild, half human. Still, the cabin felt smaller each day. The once spacious living room was now cluttered with makeshift climbing posts, chew toys, and padded corners to prevent accidents. At night, when Echo padded restlessly from wall to wall, Daniel sensed her frustration. She would sit by the window staring out at the vast, snow-blanketed forest, tail flicking, body taut with longing. He wondered if she knew, somewhere in her bones, that she belonged out there. And yet, every time he cracked the door, she hesitated, pressing close to him instead of bounding into the night. It was as if two halves of her nature pulled in opposite directions, one urging her to vanish into the trees, the other chaining her to the warmth of the cabin, to the man who had become her family. Daniel felt it too, pride in her growth, joy in their bond, but shadowed always by the question he dared not speak aloud. How long could this balance last? Winter thawed into spring, and Echo's world expanded beyond the cabin walls. Daniel began bringing her to the wildlife center for regular checkups, carrying her in a reinforced crate that seemed far too small for her restless energy. At nearly 30 pounds, she was still technically a juvenile, but her long legs and thickening shoulders hinted at the predator she was becoming. People stopped what they were doing when she arrived. Rangers and veterinarians leaned close, marveling at the calm way she pressed her nose against Daniel's hand through the bars, ignoring everyone else. Most bobcats would shred this crate to ribbons, one technician muttered. She acts like a house cat. Daniel smiled faintly but said nothing. He knew better. Echo wasn't tame, not really. She was something else entirely, caught in the narrow space between dependence and instinct. The center had hoped for more. Early on, Daniel and the staff tried carefully staged introductions to other bobcats. One day, they placed Echo in a spacious outdoor pen adjacent to a rescued male of similar age. Daniel stood on the far side of the mesh fence, heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Would she recognize him as kin? Would instinct bridge the gap? At first, both bobcats approached with curiosity, tails low, ears angled forward. The male sniffed the air, then made a soft, chuffing sound. But Echo froze. Her body stiffened, fur bristling along her spine. Instead of responding, she bolted back toward Daniel, pressing herself against the fence nearest to him. The male hissed, turned away, and padded off. Subsequent attempts ended the same way. Sometimes the other bobcats showed outright hostility, growling or swiping at the mesh. Other times they avoided her entirely, as if repelled by an invisible barrier. Echo would return to Daniel's side, trembling, her nose buried in his jacket sleeve, as if to erase the encounter. An animal behaviorist finally gave the explanation Daniel had feared. She doesn't smell right. To them she's foreign, carrying the scent of humans, fabric, wood smoke. She's an outsider, and animals don't forgive outsiders. The words sank heavy into Daniel's chest. He had always known Echo's upbringing was unnatural, but hearing it, put so plainly, cut deeper than he expected. She was too human for her own kind, too wild to ever be anyone's pet. She stood balanced on a razor's edge, belonging nowhere. That night, back at the cabin, Echo sat at the window again, staring out into the dark tree line. Daniel watched her silently. What did she see out there? A life she would never have? Or simply the call of instincts she could neither silence nor follow? He reached out and laid a hand on her back. She pressed against him, releasing a soft trill, but her eyes never left the forest. The realization grew heavier with each passing week. She could not stay in his cabin forever. Already she leapt onto shelves he thought unreachable, shredded chair legs with idle claws, prowled the cramped space with restless energy. And yet, to cast her out into the wild would be a death sentence. She lacked the skills to hunt, the instincts to fight rivals, the distrust needed to survive among predators and humans alike. For Daniel, the conflict mirrored his own life in ways he didn't admit. He too lived between two worlds, still tethered to the memory of a wife who was gone, yet drawn toward the new and fragile bond that had come into his life by accident. Neither fully past nor fully present, he existed in the same liminal space as Echo. It was clear if she was to survive, he would have to create something entirely new. A place where wild and human could meet without demanding she choose. But such a place did not yet exist. And so the question pressed in on him, heavier each day. What kind of life could he build for a creature who belonged to neither world? The answer came slowly, not in a single flash of inspiration, but in the long hours Daniel spent watching Echo pace the cabin. She pressed her paws against the window frame as if it were a barrier to some greater destiny, her breath fogging the glass while the forest beyond beckoned. Each time Daniel felt the same knot tighten in his chest. She couldn't live caged in four walls, yet the wild would devour her in days. So he began to plan. It started with a map of the land surrounding the wildlife center, his fingers tracing the wooded parcels he knew were up for sale. Most were too costly, but one 2-acre stretch caught his eye. Dense with pine and birch, with a narrow brook cutting through, and a scattering of boulders where bobcats could sun themselves. It was wild enough to awaken Echo's instincts, yet close enough to the center for veterinary support. To buy it, Daniel sold his snowmobile, drained the savings he'd been hoarding for years, and even borrowed from an old friend. Every dollar felt like another piece of security torn away, but when he looked at Echo, sleeping curled into the plaid shirt, he knew there was no other choice. Through spring and summer, he worked with volunteers from the center. They built high fences hidden among the trees, not to confine Echo, but to shield her from hunters and trespassers. Within the enclosure, Daniel crafted two distinct zones. On one side, raw wilderness, towering trees for climbing, rocks for leaping, brush dense with scents of rabbit and deer. On the other, a home section, a small roofed shelter with familiar comforts, the worn sofa from his cabin, a basket of toys Echo had shredded through the months, and of course, the old flannel shirt carefully tucked into a sleeping corner. The design was deliberate. He didn't want Echo to feel pushed wholly into the wild or anchored solely to human habits. Instead, he created a bridge between the two, a place where she could wander between instinct and memory as freely as her heart required. The work nearly broke him. His hands bled from hauling lumber, his back ached from days spent digging posts, and at night he returned to the cabin so tired he could barely keep his eyes open during Echo's feedings. Yet each morning she greeted him with a trill, rubbing against his leg as though sensing his sacrifice. It became their shared project, her future built from his sweat, her resilience fueling his determination. By autumn, The sanctuary stood ready. Daniel walked the length of it slowly, testing each latch, checking every gap in the fencing. The forest section whispered with falling leaves, while in the home section the sofa sat quietly, waiting. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't natural. But it was theirs. Standing at the gate, Daniel felt both relief and fear. He had given Echo a place in the world, but whether she would accept it, whether she could learn to live in this hybrid space, remained the question. He looked down at her by his side, the plaid shirt dragging in her teeth like a child's blanket, and murmured, "This is for you. Let's see if it's enough." The day Daniel brought Echo to her new home was clear and cold, the kind of autumn morning when the air smelled of wood smoke and frost. He opened the gate slowly, expecting her to bound forward into the trees with the joy of release. Instead, Echo froze. Her ears flattened, her body crouched low, and she pressed against his leg as though the vastness before her was too much to comprehend. For hours she refused to move beyond the shelter. She circled the sofa, crawled under the familiar basket of toys, and dragged the plaid flannel into a corner as though staking a claim. Each time Daniel tried coaxing her toward the forest side, she chirped anxiously, tail flicking, then darted back to his feet. A colleague watching from outside whispered, "Maybe she's not ready." Daniel only shook his head. She will be. She just needs time. That night, he stayed with her. He lay on the sofa while Echo curled beside him, her small body trembling against the shirt she clutched. He whispered encouragements as the wind rattled branches above them. "This is yours now. No one's going to take it away." It was the next afternoon when change finally came. Daniel was reading on the sofa when a rustle stirred from the far side of the enclosure. He looked up to find Echo gone. Heart racing, he stepped outside and scanned the trees. There she was, halfway up a pine, her lean body hugging the trunk, golden eyes wide with exhilaration. For a long moment she clung nervously, claws dug deep. Then, as if remembering something older than fear, she climbed higher, slipping gracefully from branch to branch. Sunlight filtered across her spotted coat, catching on the muscles that rippled beneath her fur. She paused at the top, turning to look down at him. Daniel felt his throat tighten. This was not the helpless cub in a shoebox, nor the restless shadow prowling his cabin. This was Echo, the bobcat she was always meant to be, alive with instinct, joy and freedom. He raised a hand in quiet salute, whispering to himself, "That's it, girl. Find yourself." In that moment, the sanctuary was no longer just a project. It was a promise fulfilled. For several weeks, Echo explored her new world alone. She marked favorite spots, the flat boulder where she basked each morning, the tallest pine she claimed as her lookout, the shelter where the plaid flannel still anchored her nights. Yet Daniel sensed something missing. Her eyes lingered too long on the empty spaces. Her trills, once filled with playful energy, sometimes carried a plaintive edge. The center's staff had seen it before. Even solitary animals needed some measure of kinship, a presence that spoke their language. After long discussions, they proposed introducing another rescue, Sierra, a young female bobcat of nearly the same age. She had been confiscated from an illegal backyard cage in Vermont, thin and wary, but not entirely wild. Like Echo, she lived between two worlds. The first meeting was tense. Sierra was led into the adjacent enclosure, separated from Echo by a strong mesh fence. Echo froze, tail rigid, ears pitched forward. Sierra crouched low, her body quivering, eyes locked on the strange bobcat before her. Daniel held his breath, ready for claws or snarls. But aggression never came. Instead, Sierra released a soft chirrup, the same sound Echo had once made when calling for Daniel in the night. Echo responded in kind, tentative but clear. The two edged closer until only the fence divided them, their noses nearly touching. For the first time, Echo did not bolt for Daniel's side. She stayed, eyes wide, as though recognizing a mirror she could finally reach. Days passed in cautious ritual. The two bobcats circled one another at the fence, exchanged trills and chuffs, and sometimes sprawled side by side in the sun, the barrier between them shrinking in significance. Daniel visited often, his heart caught between relief and a sharp pang of loss. She was finding companionship beyond him, and though it was right, it hurt. 2 weeks later, the fence was removed. Echo and Sierra hesitated, then stepped forward, tails swaying slowly, ears pricked. They sniffed, circled, and, after a long pause, bounded into a game of chase that carried them from tree to rock and back again. Their cries filled the crisp air, not of loneliness, but of play. Tears blurred Daniel's vision as he watched. Echo no longer needed him alone. She was finding her place, not as the rejected cub he once carried in a shoebox, but as a true bobcat running free beside her own kind. Winter returned, laying its quiet hand across the sanctuary. Snow gathered in the pines, softening every branch, every rock, every trail. Daniel stood at the edge of the enclosure, breath clouding in the cold, watching Echo and Sierra move together through the white landscape. They chased each other with sudden bursts of speed, vanishing into the trees, then reappearing side by side, their coats glowing against the snow. At night, Echo still returned to the shelter where the old plaid flannel waited. She poured it into a nest before curling down, amber eyes softening as Daniel entered. No matter how far she roamed during the day, she carried pieces of her old life with her, trust, comfort, a strange habit that bridged cubhood and adulthood. She was wild, yes, but never entirely. She lived between worlds, and perhaps that was what made her story so rare. Daniel leaned against the fence, memories pressing in, the first cries in the pines, the shoebox by the stove, the sleepless nights when he thought she wouldn't survive. He thought of the laughter when she first wrapped herself in that flannel shirt, of the pride when she climbed her first tree. And now, here she was, strong, radiant, alive. Her future no longer bound to his arms, but to the world he had built for her. Rejection had not ended her story. It had simply rewritten it. Daniel understood then what Echo had taught him, that survival isn't always about returning to what was lost. Sometimes it's about creating something new. Spaces where love and instinct can coexist, where boundaries soften, where the wild and the human find harmony. In the hush of the snowy pines, he whispered, "This is your world now." And Echo, hearing him, lifted her head, a trill rising into the cold air, an answer, an echo of belonging.